Contemporary Scottish film, the social realist aesthetic, has a long established preoccupation with masculinity and maleness that is rooted in cultural representations of Glaswegian Clydism, reflecting a hyper-masculine culture of industrialism, drinking and violence in male-dominated spaces and places such as shipyards, factories and pubs, leaving female characters often on the periphery of these narratives, posing the question of how female identities are constructed in Scottish social realist films. Samantha Leigh describes social realist films as often tending to feature marginalised characters or previously underrepresented topics. Focusing particularly on the representation of female identity, this video essay will use the films The Party's Just Beginning, Red Road and Morven Caller as case studies to exemplify how these films construct female identity as centred around experiences of isolation, utilising a poetic social realist aesthetic. Centering around themes of disillusionment and loss, female identity is constructed through a visual character-driven narrative that places its female protagonist at the forefront as they grapple with their own internal struggles amongst societal struggles of the world around them. The work of Gillan, Ramsay and Arnold holds an added layer of authenticity through the influence of the director's own lived experiences as working class women, having struggled through barriers of marginalisation within society and the film industry.
In the world of film, that there are just not many women film directors. So,
according to Creative Scotland's 2017 Understanding Diversity in the Arts Survey, barriers for female directors include gender, ethnicity and class.
My career and liked the work.
So how did someone from a working class home in Glasgow and a woman as well achieve so much in filmmaking? Can't have been easy.
I think I just went this strange path where
Female identity is multifaceted, it's intersectional. The work of Arnold and Ramsay has paved the way for young filmmakers such as Gillan to delve into filmmaking.
My cinematic influences in general, I don't know that I sort of tried to emulate anyone or anything in particular. And Lynn Ramsay, who's Scottish.
All three directors utilise a form of poetic realism that foregrounds the artistic hand of the director. These films are part of a stylistic poetic realist aesthetic that follows in the footsteps of a masculinist bias in British social realist films of the 20th century. Sarah Hockenhill describes poetic realism as an expansion of the work of filmmakers like Ken Loach to create a new realism or new poetic realism that expresses film thematically through an almost art cinema template, showcasing marginalised characters, and in the case of these films, working class women. You can see the influence going as far back to the kitchen sink realist film A Taste of Honey. British film critic Andrew Higson identifies a staple of the realist genre as that long shot of that town from that hill, that's seen in the still from the film, and later repeatedly utilised in new poetic realist films. This long shot with a large depth of field is characterised as overlooking a dilapidated rural landscape or fading industrial town, as the main character contemplates their disillusioned youth and isolation. For example, in The Party's Just Beginning, Lucy frequents the location of where her friend killed herself a year earlier, a high bridge which looks down onto the train tracks. This shot is a mechanism for showing a sense of isolation and removing the protagonist from the socio-economic turmoil below, humanising the main social issues in the film. For instance, the social issues of suicide of close male friend in The Party's Just Beginning and in Morven Caller, and deprivation and violence in Red Road. In Red Road, Jackie watches the world from the high angle of the CCTV footage she views every day at work, separated from society physically, not actively participating, silently watching. This is also seen in The Party's Just Beginning, in a reoccurring sequence of close-ups and mid-shots of the main character Lucy as she watches the lives of her neighbours through their windows, viewing the warmth and community of their domestic spheres from the darkness of her bedroom window, both isolated within their own grief, Lucy and Jackie watch the normalcy of the lives of those around them, on the outside margins of society, looking in. These poetic social realist films can also be seen as a cinema of interiority, giving insight into the internal emotional state of the main protagonist through the usage of tight close-up, focusing on the main character's face, different body parts and objects, creating a closeness between camera and subject, and this positioning creates a high level of intimacy between the viewer and the characters, giving insight into their inner struggles as they deal with loss. Marion Keane has noted the medium of film, and specifically the camera, takes the nature of human interiority as its fundamental subject. Tight framing, performance, and cinematography cues to the character's state of mind and emotions. Adapting social realist aesthetics by utilising the influence of a close-up relevant to the tradition of European art cinema, such as in the work of Agnes Varda. Gillen, Arnold and Ramsey all closely utilise extreme close-ups of their characters' faces and tight over-the-shoulder shots that follow the protagonist's point of view to create what David Calhoun refers to as a first-person cinema. Due to a lack of dialogue, majority of the scenes in these three films feature long periods of silence, except for soft diegetic sounds in the background and emotive non-diegetic scoring. This differs from the masculinist tradition of externalising feelings through violence, outbursts and shouting in Scottish social realist films. Despite that the protagonists speak very little, Lucy, Malvern and Jackie still have a high level of agency, created through point-of-view driven visuals. The facial expressions of lead actresses Katie Dickie, Karen Gillan and Samantha Morton are emphasised with the usage of extreme close-ups, placing performance as a main method of storytelling, giving insight to their characters' inner emotional journeys. However, facial expressions are not the only body part used as a part of performance. Close-ups of hands are used to establish an attempt at reaching for intimacy and connection between the suicidal male characters in Morven Caller and The Party's Just Beginning. In Red Road, the opening shot of the film is of Jackie's hands, the tool she uses as a CCTV operator, which she uses to connect with the outside world from her isolated position behind the surveillance camera. When objects or body parts are surrounded by silence and followed with a close-up, this shows the importance and significance to the narrative, exemplifying how the film prioritises visual storytelling over dialogue to create a poetic aesthetic and show the character's emotional state. For example, when Malvern interacts physically with the landscape, submerging her hands in the earth, or when she touches a rotting carrot, her physical interactions with dirt and decay can be seen as representative of her interactions with death itself. Jackie silently picks up the belongings of her dead daughter and husband and holds them close. The strained expression on her face externalizes her internal struggle with grief. The usage of close-ups of different body parts and objects contributes to a multi-sensory experience with places and landscapes within the mise-en-scène, aiding in the usage of emotional subjectivity as the dominant technique to convey character. Isolation is conveyed through the cinematography, specifically the dichotomy between soft, out-of-focus warm light and dark black and blue hues, as well as through the positioning of the main character within the mise-en-scène, placing them alone as the only character and point of focus in the frame. Adhering to less of a traditional British social realist aesthetic that tends to use natural light, it uses more of a poetic art cinema style that uses the contrast of bright, soft colours with the darkness of the night. In The Party's Just Beginning, this is seen in the repeated tracking shot of Lucy as she walks to her home from the city centre of Inverness, and in Red Road when Jackie walks home from work. These shots utilise a shallow depth of field that gives the colourful lights on the dark street a soft glow, adding warmer hues of orange from the street lamps with contrast of the darkness of the night. These shots are reminiscent of Nordic noir style cinematography, which is in part due to the trend of transnational co-production between Nordic and Scottish production companies, such as in the case of Sigma Films and Centropa, who created Red Road. Placing the protagonist in focus with the soft glow in the background, the reoccurrence of these shots can be seen as representative of the passage of time and temporality. An approach to subjectivity of any sorts demands a persistent engagement with notions of time and temporality. Time is vital to lived experience. Lived experience is vital to the encounter with time as a phenomenon. The repetition of the shots of Lucy and Jackie walking home alone in the darkness of the night is reminiscent of their isolation and lack of interaction with others. Consistently enveloped in the darkness is also creating a sense of disillusionment and is representative of their grief. The passage of time is measured in the repetition of daily occurrences, and the daily occurrence of Lucy's flashbacks of her dead friend falling off the bridge in the darkness of the night showcases her struggle with loss. In Morven Colour, in the cinematography of the opening scene, the lights of the Christmas tree blink steadily in the background, blurred and out of focus, illuminating the dark room every other second. As a measurement of time, the recurring shots of the soft out-of-focus lights of the Christmas tree and the street lamps on the dark roads of Glasgow, Inverness and Oban illuminate the darkness and can be seen as representative of the healing process for all three women as they learn to live with their grief over the course of time. As a part of a new Scottish cinema, these films derive their Scottishness particularly from the geographical location where filming took place. Rooting stories in Scottish council estates in Inverness and Glasgow and on the streets of Oban gives these films a sense of place that allows for a sense of cultural specificity, whilst themes of loss and isolation make it universal for international audiences. Subverting romanticised representations of the Scottish Highlands as a space of magic, fantasy, mysticism, battle, and for outsiders to happen upon, such as in Brigadoon, Brave, Highlander, Braveheart, and Local Hero, and Morven Colour and The Party's Just Beginning, the relationship between character and the Highland landscape is that of one of isolation. They're physically separated from the more populous central belt of Scotland geographically and emotionally through their own disillusionment after the loss of a loved one. Following the social realist tradition of depicting socio-economic issues such as drug usage, drinking, lack of economic opportunity and suicide, these films reject the pervasive, romanticised view of Scotland, its landscape and inhabitants, providing an authentic perspective of a changing sense of Scottish female identity, from mythical, magical, untamed Highland lassie to a modern-day depiction of the realities of coming of age in a rural community. In the final scene of the film, as Lucy returns to the location where her friend died, she contemplates suicide herself, but decides against it, returning to her home, staying in Inverness and rejoining her family. However, Morven's relationship with the Highland landscape is that of one of a desire to escape Scotland, of a desire to leave and shirk off her past identity and trauma in order to live in Spain as a new person. In the last shot, she is surrounded by people in a club, yet still isolated and alone, listening to her headphones, removing all the trappings of everyday life that conventionally constitute a social identity. She's left behind her name, job, home, friends, occupation, conversation, routine, and immersed herself into a physical environment which occupies her on a sensory level. The emotional distance conveyed in the blank expressions with she meets questions and sometimes stares at the camera, distancing herself emotionally. When Lucy remains in Inverness, Morven physically isolates herself from her trauma, from her past life, geographically, in the deserted Spanish interior under the hot sun, contrasting greatly with the landscapes of her old life. This plays into an idea of escapism and a desire for something greater in Scottish female coming-of-age tales, leaving behind lack of prospects for opportunities in more populated spheres. Rural Scottish films foreground young women as central protagonists, examining tensions between rootedness and escape, offering a welcome alternative to the urban, masculine and realist discourse of subjectivity and place that come to dominate representations of Scotland. Red Road shows how female identity can be constructed through the relationship between character and the urban landscape. Prior to the start of the film, Jackie, a working-class mother, loses her husband and child and as a result, a main part of her identity. Utilising location shooting at the actual Red Road flat estate, the tower blocks that are the film's namesake can be seen as representative of Jackie's foray from the world of her previous normalcy into a new one of danger. The dilapidated tower blocks are indicative of an unequal urban development and social and economic inequalities, and Jackie actively utilises her access to CCTV footage to scour the estate for a man who was just released from prison, who killed her family. Isolated by her own grief and desperate to find purpose after the loss of her identity as a wife and mother, Jackie makes revenge her mission. Jackie's not a resident of the Red Road flats, but rather an interloper attempting to find answers, deviating away from previous portrayals of women in social realist films as a mother figure, usually confined to domestic spaces with the purpose of caring for others. Red Road depicts how the loss of her own sense of self, her motherhood, presents a need for closure that physically draws her to the Red Road flats. Dilapidated tower blocks are representative of the opposite of the warmth of the domestic sphere. They are constructed in a way that isolates women in a particularly difficult place for mothers, as Red Roads, a real housing estate, was on the periphery of Glasgow. It was portrayed as a dangerous place, housing ex-convicts, depicting poor living conditions, cramped spaces, dilapidation and a lack of green spaces, the literal opposite of the warm, comforting portrayals of domesticity and intimacy associated with previous depictions of working-class motherhood in social realist films, particularly in the work of Lynne Ramsay. It is also crucial to acknowledge the wider scope of Scottish social realist films beyond Red Road, Morven Colour and The Party's Just Beginning that provide a further, more complex insight into female identity. For example, A Fond Kiss, directed by Ken Loach, provides an essential example of the intersectional nature of female identity.
I am a Glaswegian, Pakistani, teenager woman of Muslim descent, who supports Glasgow Rangers in a Catholic school, because I'm a dazzling mixture and I'm proud of it. I call on this House to defeat this hypocritical motion. Bring it on!
While A Fond Kiss does not necessarily fit in with the poetic social realist aesthetic, it is a prime example of a celebration of difference in a social realist film and a desire to meld cultures together. The drawback of Morven Colour, The Party's Just Beginning and Red Road is that they all feature a similar type of female protagonist, whereas A Fond Kiss has laid the groundwork for hopefully encouraging more social realist films to reflect the diversity of a contemporary Scotland. As society is transformed by the 2020 global pandemic, isolation and loss are as pertinent as ever. It's difficult to predict how social distancing and isolation will influence our sense of self, our identity. As seen in these films, out of loss and loneliness can come a sense of agency, resilience to move forward, through a poetic social realist aesthetic, through the usage of close-ups, cinematography, and the relationship between character and landscape. These films aid in constructing an authentic portrayal of the complexity of female identity, and spending a little time in the first-person cinema of their worlds makes us feel a little less alone.